So I'm Nic Carter. I'm here with Matt Hill, who is the co-founder of Start9 Labs, which is a very, very cool project, which is not the focus of this fireside chat. But what we will be talking about is privacy, liberty, and the pursuit of Bitcoin. We're actually kind of pivoting the topic a little bit. So
the pursuit of Bitcoin is definitely going to be more of a metaphor.
Yeah, so I think what we actually should talk about is, sovereign computing and sort of where we are in that transition, if it is occurring, and then how that relates to Bitcoin, whether those are mutually supportive ideas. So anyway, let's dive right into it. How about that? Do you want to maybe very briefly introduce yourself?
Beyond being a co-founder of Start9, I'm a technologist. I'm a developer at the application level. I don't, by any stretch, pretend to know much about the base layers of things and network architecture, but I like building apps, and I like building companies, and I like building teams. And it's kind of what I do, and I'm very, very passionate about individual liberty and using technology to make individual liberty more accessible to individuals.
So let's start on that topic. So when it comes to liberty and the internet, I think probably everyone would agree right now that we are at an extremely illiberal time in terms of our ability to use basic internet applications and infrastructure in a way that's sort of sovereign, that allows us discretion over how we're represented online, and what of our data is divulged and not, and even effectively our private property on the internet, which is the handles that we sort of inject economic value into, and the ability for you to be deprived of that at a moment's notice. So subjectively, my view is that it's at a massive point of centralization. Certain sort of, if you look at the history of the internet, it seems at its sort of nadir of centralization. Is that kind of a characterization you'd agree with?
In general, yeah. I'll break it down a little bit in layers. The base layer of the internet, the internet protocols themselves, TCP/IP, and how computers talk to each other is not inherently flawed. There's no fundamental issue with how computers communicate over time and space. The problem really exists more at the service layer, the server layer, right? The manner in which we have implemented these internet primitives has resulted in a very centralized system. It wasn't inherently designed that way, right? Like two computers can talk to each other, and then three computers can talk through the third computer, and that's all fine. This is kind of reminiscent of the Lightning Network. But early on, I think it became apparent that this was very difficult to do for an individual to be a node on the internet and participate in this inherently decentralized technology. And so people who were good at systems administration, what we now refer to often as DevOps engineering, took advantage of their skill set, as they should in any capitalist system, and essentially built products around it that would remove the necessity for an individual to have these skills. And they said, running a server is hard, so we'll run a giant server for everyone, and you just plug into us. And it's super convenient. And by the way, it's free, right? Because we're planning to extort you later. That wasn't part of the narrative, but everyone plugs into them, and you end up with what we have today, which is a sort of hub and spoke, aka client server, aka server master slave architecture. And it doesn't need to be like that. But the fact that it is poses some immediate kind of challenges or problems, but actually some real dangers as you project into the future.
So one of the things that kind of astonished me this year was, obviously we kind of expect at this point the politicization of who is able to use Western sort of Silicon Valley tech company internet applications. That's sort of one thing. that I think we haven't made our peace with, but it's just a sort of fact. And that's just the way the world works today. But what shocked me was that internet infrastructure, like underlying core pieces that are not applications, which are actually just required to be online, like Cloudflare, DDoS protection, is now additionally politicized. And it's like we're getting down to deep, deep deplatforming, whereby it's now a political question who can use sort of the underlying structure of the internet as well. I mean, was that something that you expected to occur? Because that actually took me back a little bit.
Expected in a general sense, but the exact implementations of these kind of vulnerabilities or exploitations of these vulnerabilities we're sort of experiencing in real time and learning and reacting to. The degree to which internet infrastructure is centralized, I think, shocked a lot of people. For instance, Amazon S3 went down. I think it was 2 years ago, year and a half ago, due to a server configuration issue, similar to what happened with Facebook's ecosystem a week or two ago, and like half the internet went down. And I think a lot of people were just shocked that half the internet was running on AWS. And again, this doesn't mean that AWS necessarily is privy to private information. It just means that they're a central point of failure, that can fail due to either incompetence, in this case, or maybe not incompetence, but at least a mistake, or some sort of intentional attack, or in specific cases, targeted censorship, right? Because while AWS might not be able to see exactly what you're doing on your EC2 instance, they can absolutely turn it off, and they know who you are, right?
So, I mean, where we've gone now is, this world where corporates are making unilateral decisions in terms of who can access their products, and they could do it with high leverage and at scale. And then finally, now we've seen governments realize, well, if I can control these companies that are domiciled in my borders, and they're enormous companies with high leverage that can deploy and control internet services at scale, I can control the flow of information. And they've become much more adept at this, And so I think what we've seen recently is like the largest internet companies are now effectively not under attack, but governments are trying to sort of effectively capture them so that they can promote specific policies. And in some cases that works, like, search engines have to adhere to, Chinese policy to be active there. But we also see it sort of occurring in the West as well, where you have informal campaigns of pressure. Is that, something that you expect to get worse and to have the internet effectively become an extension of state power? Or do you think that we can kind of step back from the brink there?
I do expect it to get worse. I don't know if it's as one-sided as states co-opting companies. I think that there's sort of a mutualism going on there,
Right.
where those two entities are kind of merging into one. Does Google run the government, or does the government run Google? It's really hard to tell the difference these days. But I do expect the consequence for the individual to continue to deteriorate. Did that just turn off?
You're good. So, all right. So on that topic, states, internet. So when we were having our pre-fireside chat, you coined this term, or maybe you had it before, sovereign computing. And I've heard a lot of expressions of decentralizing the web, restoring power to the edges of the network. Some people talk about the D web. Some people talk about Web3. Probably not the kind of people that are at this conference. And then sovereign computing was your term. Tell me what sort of that means to you, and why it's the best term for what's happening.
Great. Yeah, when we first started Start9, the first T-shirts we ever made, which we still sell, just say Start9 on the front, and on the back it says sovereign computing. So this has been part of our DNA since the beginning. I'm not aware of any other, I think we coined it. And we did that because it just fit. Like, that wasn't a huge discussion that we had. That was just sort of naturally how we described what we were trying to accomplish. Another alternative, just to help people understand what that means, would be to call it independent computing, right? It is computing that does not require the trust, and in often case even the involvement of a third party, right? But as long as you're not trusting third parties to fulfill your computing needs, then you are engaged in sovereign computing, as in computing that cannot be stopped, censored, inspected, surveilled, etc. And computing in general, right? This isn't confined to Bitcoin or financial matters. This is, can you today text message a friend of yours without trusting a third party to deliver that message or to keep that message confidential? And almost nobody at any given moment can answer that question yes. I mean, it's really, really hard to do. In fact, I would argue that sovereign computing is not actually an achievable goal, that it is an ideal to be striven for, and that asymptotically we can get closer and closer to accomplishing it, but there's always going to be a degree of trust necessary because it's not this binary thing, just like privacy and just like security. They are just ideals to be striven for. But hopefully we can design systems such that the amount of trust is minimal, and that if that trust is breached, the damage caused is also minimal. So like, if you're going to use a custodial solution for Bitcoin, you should put like a tiny amount on there.
So when you aspire to sovereign computing, in your mind, are you trying to engage in this sort of, not to use a loaded term, but reactionary movement to restore the internet to the quote unquote original vision of the sort of, I guess, founders of of the internet? Like, is that the objective, or is it responding to the current architecture and saying we have a better way, but this is actually different from what we had before?
So I definitely can't speak to the intentions of some of the early internet designers, and I definitely am sure that it's not a couple of founders, right? The internet was a sort of an emergent thing that came about from many, many years of research and efforts from lots of people. But I can speak to the design of it, right? In retrospect, when you look back at what emerged from those collaborative efforts, is inherently a decentralized system. The internet is designed to be decentralized, just like Bitcoin is designed to be decentralized, right? But if there was one node running on one cloud server and all transactions were flowing through that one node, then Bitcoin would not be decentralized. And so the fact that something is designed to be decentralized and the fact that it is actualized in that manner do not necessarily go hand in hand, and it's not predetermined. So we are, in essence, striving to fulfill maybe not the original vision, but at least the original design of the internet by making it as decentralized as possible, as the design permits.
And I wasn't really that on the internet in the '90s. I'm showing my age a bit there, but actually, I don't think I used the internet until after 2000.
Am I a lot older than you?
It's possible. It's possible. I had a deprived childhood. I had to read books and things like that. So, I mean, was there actually a time when the internet was this sort of utopian, decentralized dreamland of everyone running their own server and their email service and things like that?
There was definitely a time when the internet was decentralized. It would be tough to call it the internet at that point, and it also wasn't utopian because it was almost impossible to use. So, a utopian decentralized internet would be at scale and easy to use. But yes, in the early days of the internet, there were geeks and hobbyists running, servers that were talking to each other, and it was awesome. And then, a few of those geeks and nerds built what are today the tech giants.
So I want to get to the Bitcoin specific portion, but before we do that, I mean, what's your level of optimism to actually maybe not achieve this goal of sovereign computing, but to grant some power and discretion back to the end user of online services? I mean, how do you feel about it? Like, from my perspective, things are pretty bad for the average sort of internet resident. You're either effectively under, de jure under state control or de facto. What's your level of optimism there?
So I'll briefly mention that I agree with you on the state of affairs. And there's, different applications and different use cases are sort of more or less, in shambles. But I'm extremely optimistic. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, and neither would the rest of the team, if we didn't think that what we were going after was achievable, right? Nobody wants to play a losing game. I also do not believe that anything is predetermined, right? It is entirely possible that we continue down a horribly dystopian path and the internet becomes the largest cage humanity could ever imagine. But that depends on the actions of the people building these systems today. And we feel very strongly that we are playing potentially an important role in helping to guide the future in that direction. So we're very optimistic. We have the technology possible to do this. It just requires an enormous amount of execution and perseverance and integrity.
Is the peak point of centralization ahead of us or behind us?
It's behind us.
That's what I'm talking about. So, all right. So, sovereign computing and Bitcoin, what is the intersection? Does the one depend on the other? Does Bitcoin bring back? So is it the catalyst to restore us to a model of sovereign computing? What's the dependency there? Which one depends on the other? Are they mutually supportive?
I would say they're mutually supportive. I think Bitcoin was absolutely a catalyst for us, right? Start9 would not exist. I wouldn't be doing what I am doing now if it wasn't for Bitcoin. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Right? One is that Bitcoin gave me the freedom to be able to pursue things and not be beholden to a job, et cetera, et cetera. But also just the inspiration that Bitcoin gives. It showed us that there is a way to win here, right? It exposed the underbelly of the beast. It showed us how to do decentralization. It showed us the flaw in the existing system and how it can be used. And so we are simply taking the essence of Bitcoin, this idea of decentralization pretty much at all costs. That is the thing that cannot be relinquished, and trying to apply it to computing in general. And I think Bitcoin needs a decentralized computing architecture to fulfill its mission of being sound money, or a truth machine upon which many things may be able to be built. But again, if there is a single Bitcoin node running on a single server and one miner that controls all the hash power, we haven't really done anything except slap new words on an old system. And so we have to decentralize computing. We have to put nodes in every home, and not just Bitcoin. But, again, even if Bitcoin is fully decentralized and everyone's running in their own node, if for you to pay me, I have to send you my address or invoice via text message, and that text message channel is entirely compromised, then to a degree, so is Bitcoin, right? So we need to both create infrastructure beneath and around Bitcoin in order for it to fulfill its dream. And the inverse is also true. In order for sovereign computing to exist, there has to be some sort of value transport and security layer to that system, some sort of incentive to keep it going. Now, does it have to be Bitcoin? No. But if it's not Bitcoin, it's going to be whatever we next call Bitcoin, right? Like it's Bitcoin itself can evolve, fork, whatever it needs to do. But yeah, there's no decentralized computing without value transport.
So let's say for the sake of argument, Bitcoin has a fairly robust decentralized computing architecture. We've at least made a very good start. What else is there? Like, what are people going to be running on their own node in their own home in 5 years' time, aside from just their Bitcoin node and their Lightning node?
Anything, in theory, that can be done in a centralized custodial manner can also be done in a decentralized, non-custodial manner, in theory. Has all that software been written? No. The open source, self-hosted, P2P and federated equivalents of the centralized services offered today are not up to snuff, right? You can get close. Compare something like Nextcloud to G Suite, right? Nextcloud is extremely powerful, self-hosted software that requires no third-party dependencies. And G Suite is this totally centralized, pay per month subscription model thing that's super convenient. And it is better in the sense that it's easier to use, more convenient, et cetera. But there's no reason why that has to be the case. It's the case because of funding, right? It's capital investment. The money has gone towards centralized things, and for good reason. It's because they're showing profit, right? But we now have new incentive systems arising with Lightning and these, decentralized protocols that can actually earn money. Like we're inventing a new economic system here. And so I'm very bullish on decentralized, open source, self-hosted technology because we now have a means of making money within it.
So I'll admit I'm a G Suite user and I'm not a Nextcloud user, so I'll expose myself there. What would have to be different for someone like me to make the switch? Is it simply that the software hasn't received as much attention due to the difficulty of capitalizing open source software? Or is there something else? Is it the convenience factor? Is it the fact that I'm locked into the Google walled garden? What would have to change?
Sure. So as a consumer, right, you don't care much about how much funding went into one project or another, right? The fact that G Suite has Google behind it.
The UI and the UI, you notice it in
it's
terms of the quality of the service.
Right. It's the resulting product. So what we have always said is that you will never be able to reach total parity with the centralized software services with decentralized open source ones, because there's always going to be, like, you asymptotically can get closer and closer and closer. Like, there's no reason that a self-hosted P2P messaging app cannot be as good as Telegram, with one exception, and that is forgot password. It's like at some point, the user has to take even just this tiny inch of responsibility for their own lives in order to self-host in a fully sovereign way. And we are bullish on that, in that we think people will do that. We are quite convinced that if people are made aware enough of the dangers and problems and challenges and, quite frankly, costs of using centralized services and getting nickel and dimed on a month-by-month basis, that they will eventually put up with some degree, some minor sacrifice in convenience or responsibility in order to accomplish it. And we think that the end game of that is just remembering a password.
Is that maybe one of the unanticipated contributions of Bitcoin, is that it normalized this idea of holding cryptographic material self-custodied, and now we're going to extend that to, password management and things like that?
Hell yeah. That's exactly what Bitcoin has done for computing in general. It is, Bitcoin is the largest consumer-ready public-private key, infrastructure and software that has ever existed. And suddenly people are asking what private keys are. They're asking what public keys are. It's becoming part of the nomenclature. Now, we're at a Bitcoin conference. Everyone here knows that. It's going to take a while to disseminate that to the general public. But at Start9, we actually consider education not as some ancillary thing to help sell products, but we consider education a sort of fundamental prerequisite to the category that we are trying to, quite frankly, invent. The idea of running a personal server out of your own home and accessing it from anywhere in the world in total privacy, while it itself is connected over P2P and federated networks on a new internet. And it's like, at some point, people are going to have to go, all right, it's new education. Right? Nobody knew how to use a computer a couple decades ago, and that education disseminated. We think we can do it again.
Well, I share your optimism, and for everyone's sake, I hope you're right. I think we have to wrap there, but thank you. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you.